Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's edition of The Midpoint. It's our first hybrid edition, which is ironic given the topic of today's webinar, which is going to be looking at the Corona Parliament over the last year, which has swept through the lockdown of Corona, has gone from fully digital to hybrid, and potentially will never go back. In today's conversation, we would like to speak about whether Parliament has done its job in the last year, and going forward, if this is really a new normal, and what does that mean for our democracy? So to begin, a word about The Midpoint. The Midpoint is a centrist digital platform in which we discuss political ideas. Our current offering is a monthly discussion like this, which is based on expert long paper. If you want to have a look at our recordings, or if you want to read the long papers, please go to www.themidpoint.org.za. In the same vein, today's hybrid discussion is with Rebecca Sibanda, and who has written a new paper, and she wrote it together with the Parliamentary Monitoring Group. We'd like to thank the PMG for joining the Midpoint in supporting this paper. The paper is titled Implications of a Virtual Parliament on its Constitutional Mandate, and it reviews how Parliament's operations have fared in the last 400 odd days of lockdown. Our conversation will barely scratch the surface, so please do go and have a look at the paper on www.themidpoint.org.za. The paper will also be made available in this webinar a little bit later. Good. Joining us from Johannesburg to talk to us is the author, Rebecca Sibanda, and Marianne Merten is together with me here in Cape Town, and hopefully the technology will all work out. Rebecca is a constitutional law expert with a background in human rights and international law. Most recently, she has been working in Parliament as a researcher for a political party and then with PMG, so experienced firsthand what it looked like behind the scene as Parliament went through this transition. And then on my left here is Marianne Merten, who writes for the Daily Maverick and is a well-known face and voice on Parliament. She's very candid, which we enjoy. And with 26 years of experience, I think the only thing that nowadays would surprise her is if the ANC did not extend the state of disaster another time. So, coming to me, my name is Christiaan Endres, and I am here to represent the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Please visit the website www.cas.de/South Africa to have a look at our offerings. In Germany and internationally, we promote the rule of law, multi-party democracy, and the social market economy. And today's conversation is really about the rule of law. Now, internationally, the separation of powers has been one of the crucial elements that's been developed to enforce the rule of law. The separation of power takes the forces that govern the form of government into three different spheres: the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. The executive is the president and the state. They propose policy and they enact it. The judiciary makes sure that everybody obeys the law. And then finally, the legislature, which we're going to be talking about today, elects the president. It makes the law. It's a public forum for discussion of our representatives when we vote. And then finally, it holds the executive to account. We're going to talk about whether it's been doing those roles over the last year. So I'd like to turn quickly to what we're going to be doing today. We're going to begin with Rebecca talking about her paper. Then Marianne is going to give a bit of a response, and then we're going to go into an open discussion. We're also going to have a look at the chat in the background, and I'm going to draw in questions from the chat as we go. So I see, for example, there's Mr. Gaznalar who's here in Cape Town, Megan Dick, Sue Bentley from East London nogal. So I look forward to seeing what you ask us later, and I'd like to draw to the conversation. So on that note, Rebecca, could I hand the floor to you to tell us a little bit about your paper?
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to just give a brief outline of what the paper was about, and then I will speak to the points that you have raised, Chris, namely the separation of powers, the oversight, as well as the public access that we experienced during the lockdown. So the paper touches on a number of elements, and I think the most important things to note are that because of the lockdown regulations, it was impossible for MPs to physically attend parliamentary committee meetings and plenaries. So a system had to be developed that would allow all members of parliament to log in and participate as they normally would were they in the House physically. And whilst there were a few hiccups in the beginning, I think that Parliament rallied and really got it together. And as we see now, parliamentarians attend their committee meetings and plenaries without as many hiccups as we saw in the beginning. And despite the hiccups that we saw, Parliament was able to work beyond the emergency measures. So we started to see as many plenaries, as many committee meetings being held as would have been prior to the pandemic. And what we started to see is where we started off with the purely virtual parliament, where everybody was logging in remotely. As lockdown restrictions lifted and parliamentarians were able to physically be in the House, albeit in a limited way, a hybrid sort of parliament began. And it exists today. So you have some parliamentarians who continue to log in remotely, others, depending on the urgency of the meeting or their physical presence in the seat, at the seat of Parliament in Cape Town, attend. So you have, a beautiful mixture of attendance. Whilst we also saw these great successes, the virtual and hybrid parliament is a bit limiting in that connectivity was an issue. Sometimes when there's load shedding in certain areas of the country, parliamentarians aren't able to log in and attend. Sometimes they drop from the call. Sometimes sound is a problem, there's delay. So you have a few glitches here and there that interrupt a seamless flow of parliamentary business. But other than that, we have seen that, meetings are conducted, oversight visits are still conducted. We see oversight being conducted, government representatives attend meetings and they are questioned. Question time is still taking place for all members of parliament, for government representatives, from the president. And I think that to a large extent, Parliament functioned pretty much the same way as it would have without the added technological addition. So I think, like you said, it's important for us to consider carrying this hybrid parliament forward into the future, even after the pandemic ends, because it has shown a number of benefits, accessibility for people who wouldn't normally be able to be present in parliament. It means that parliamentarians can attend to their constituencies, at the same time be in parliamentary meetings, or the distance or the time difference isn't as large because they don't have to get onto planes and go to their constituencies, especially now when they are very much needed in their constituencies in such a unique, trying period. And I think that Parliament has met the challenge. It can do better in the sense that it needs to find a way to remove all of the technological limits that it has faced, to give more access to the public, to upload videos of plenaries and committee meetings with more efficiency. Little things that I think can be fixed to allow a seamless hybrid parliament to exist and benefit the South African public. I'm going to move on now, I think, to the 3 points that you raised, Chris. During the period that the paper analyzed or evaluated, separation of powers was only, I think, a big issue at the very beginning and maybe in October. So at the very beginning, because of the way the Disaster Management Act exists, it extends power and authority to the Minister of COGTA to do what ideally the legislature would be doing, in the sense that she passed regulations, she determined to extend the state of disaster. And there was kind of a bit of a tug of war between how the public and perhaps civil society viewed the separation of powers in that instance. That why did the minister have so much power when it came to legislature? Legislature is ideally the purview of parliament. So I think the one thing that the paper notes is that passing legislature is normally an arduous process. It's a long reviewing sections, writing sections, making sure they meet constitutional muster. It takes a very long time to pass a law that will not be reviewed in the courts. So I think the Disaster Management Act sees that. It foresaw how difficult it would be to have to pass a law to deal with something that has just happened. So allowing the minister to make those kind of decisions, without having to go through a lengthy process to address immediate issues on the ground for South Africans was necessary. So I think in that case, the separation of powers shouldn't have been so contested. And we saw how I think it was a Democratic Alliance that approached the court together with it was the Helen Suzman Foundation, I think, that approached the courts and asked for a law to be enacted that dealt specifically with the pandemic, with COVID-19, and not to have the DMA cover or address all the issues that had to do with the pandemic. And we saw that in other jurisdictions that they did pass COVID-19 specific laws. For example, the UK did so, but not without lengthy processes. There was a lot of deliberation, a lot of argumentation, and there were so many annexures that had to be written as and when issues related to the pandemic arose. And that it's very onerous, and the legislature has so many other things to do, not only in relation to the pandemic, but also regular other issues that existed and that had to be addressed. So to require the legislature to turn its focus away from everyday issues that are urgent and put them on the back burner when there is a law that exists to address situations exactly like this seems redundant. So that, I think, should address the separation of powers issue. The second issue, I think, is the executive oversight that you mentioned, Chris. And that also was a bit contentious in the beginning, in that because the DMA extends authority for decision-making to the executive, it's difficult then to see how Parliament should exercise executive oversight. The DMA and the Constitution don't expressly say that Parliament should exercise any sort of oversight when the DMA when the DMA is in operation. However, because Parliament is inherently tasked with the duty of oversight, it doesn't need the express authority of an act of Parliament to say, please exercise your duty, please do your job. So even without the express authorization from the DMA or the Constitution in relation to a pandemic or a situation like this, the Parliament should have been, from the very start, saying, is the Minister of COGTA exercising her duty in the way she should be? Is she communicating timelessly? Are the regulations clear and understandable? Are they being communicated to the public in a way that is efficient? Are the police exercising their duty in relation to the regulations properly? Are South Africans abiding by the law properly? So there was room, indeed, from the very beginning for Parliament to exercise this oversight without express authorization from the DMA or the Constitution. But as Parliament picked up, as technology was introduced, as MPs were able to log on and do their job, you saw executive oversight taking place on the part of Parliament. For example, the Minister of Health and the Minister of COGTA were repeatedly brought before Parliament to be asked questions about, the state of the pandemic, what steps were being taken, whether the regulations were appropriate, whether people were... So there were a lot of things that were being done by Parliament to make sure that they were meeting their constitutional obligation of executive oversight. And they continue to do so today. And the final thing, I think, I spent a lot of time in the paper is public access. And not just public access, but also public participation. So in terms of public access, we know that South Africa doesn't have a great accessibility, especially for people who are less advantaged. So the divide between those who have and those who do not have is very wide, and it also translates to digital access. So as soon as Parliament went online, it restricted a lot of South Africans, the majority, one could argue, from accessing parliamentary proceedings, from accessing parliamentary papers, whereas before, a person could just walk into Parliament and say, I want to attend this committee meeting, should it be open to the public, and access it. Now you have to have data, you have to have a smartphone, you have to know where to look to find, these committee meetings. You might have to have a YouTube account or a Facebook account. So it's very onerous on the average South African, on a rural South African, on a student to dedicate that much data and time logging in to get access to parliamentary proceedings. Not everybody has DSTV, which is the only place that the parliamentary channel is flighted. So if you don't have access to DSTV, then you don't watch parliamentary proceedings. The rest of South Africans who do have access to, prepaid channels or data, and the time to log on at their houses if they were working remotely. Remember, a lot of South Africans were still working when the regulations were lifted, they went to work. What time do you have to say, oh, this is an interesting plenary, let me log on? So I think accessibility remains a big issue above and beyond the technological access. Closed captioning wasn't there. So if you're a person who is hard of hearing, you can't read or hear or know what's going on in Parliament. A lot of things could have been handled better, and Parliament should still consider handling it better, giving more access to people. Finally, in the public participation sphere, Parliament, I think, it's their first time having to do this remotely. So I commend Parliament for piloting the public participation remotely. I think during the Ultra hearings, they provided a space for people to be able to come and view the proceedings. Also, data was provided to certain people. I think interested parties in the relevant areas that Ultra was going to cover, data was provided. But again, it wasn't provided to everybody. It was very limited access. So again, the element of public participation we know is so important, because South Africans need to be involved in any decision-making or law passing that involves them. So if you can't involve and let South Africans have their say when you're passing a law, you're opening up that law to judicial challenge at some point. We have seen that happen time and time again in our courts. So these are some of the hiccups that we have seen in terms of this hybrid parliament that has worked incredibly well considering the circumstances. And also, if you consider that South Africa wasn't alone. All jurisdictions across the world had to rally. They had to figure out a way to make sure that Parliament continues to run efficiently, effectively, and inclusively. And every jurisdiction struggled, some more than others. Some already had, the technology in place to allow for seamless remote working, to allow for seamless remote voting by parliamentarians. So there's a lot of room still for growth and development in our Parliament, but I think we're doing pretty well.
We're trying and we're doing our best, and we've done a lot of things well, but we could do things better. Right, Marianne, maybe you could give a bit of a response, having peer-reviewed, or at least had a look at Rebecca's piece, and you've polished the door handles in Parliament and walked the corridors.
Yes, I am a little bit of a piece of the furniture there, I must admit. Look, I certainly would like to say the one thing. The assessment that Parliament has done well is absolutely supported. I think there's just absolutely no way that we can say anything else. Yes, there are hiccups. Yes, there are issues. I think the paper that was presented makes a couple of very important points. And let's tread back to right at the beginning and the points that you mentioned in terms of oversight. And that is that in March, Parliament decided to suspend itself, which I think is something that, given the time, given the context in March 2020, today is a very different time, but we need to mark that. Parliament voluntarily suspended its business. Mm-hmm. And that is a significant step. The fact that there was an outcry, the fact that there was a reaction, the fact that political parties and the administration and the presiding officers then reconsidered and resumed after the recess, which coincided with that period of suspension, is important. I think coming back to the point with regards to separation of powers, and Rebecca certainly has touched on some of the dynamics, what I would like to say is that our courts have supported the state of disaster and the Disaster Management Act. To date, it may change. Well, there's a couple of court cases still in the making. To date, the courts have said right now what is available is sufficient. It is up to Parliament to do what it must do by the Constitution, to hold the executive to account to do the oversight. So a lot of the solutions that have been sorry, the earpiece keeps on falling out.
As long as you're talking, that's okay.
A lot of the solutions that have been pursued elsewhere in the world, there's specific disaster management acts, specific COVID legislations, really haven't been necessary here. In terms of the technology and the hybrid, and I can maybe I can share it this way. Well over 10 years, there was a major renovation in Parliament, and one of the things at the time was that, you know, the officials, lovely officers in Pretoria, really did not want to always get on the plane, come down to Parliament and have to account to the MPs. So can we cut cost? It was a discussion well over 10 years already. Parliament installed video conferencing facilities in many of the committee rooms.
Well, that was lucky then.
No. They were never used. They gathered dust. So all of that reluctance to engage with video conferencing facilities of sort of very 1990s, early 2000s, kind of really was never used. And then COVID happened. And then the lockdown happened and continues to happen. I think it's day 405 of the lockdown. And suddenly, technology was no longer an issue. It had to be used for Parliament to do what it must. And absolutely hats off. I can't even imagine the scrambling behind the scenes to get things going, to get channels going, to get YouTube channels going, to set up Facebook and all of the stuff that we are benefiting from now. Yes, there are hiccups. We'll not talk about more awkward times of nudity and, you know, bottle store visits and all sorts of other things. Yes, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So we've moved on from that. I think one of the issues with regards to Parliament now having set in place the tools and the mechanism to hold to account is, and I think the paper does traverse some of it, is Zoom meetings require data, require smartphones, require access to computers. The majority of South Africans do not have that. The counter argument would be that, well, the majority of South Africans would not be able to walk into Parliament to say, can I attend?
So it's not perfect, but it's better than it was.
Absolutely. In terms of accessibility, you know, it would be really nice if Parliament would, for example, think of applying to be zero rated. I'm actually not sure if it is. It was one of the proposals that has come out of the paper that Rebecca has written.
Maybe just explain, what does zero rating mean? What is
right at the beginning of the pandemic, because we knew that it was going to be online remote rating. One of the decisions that was taken is that important like government websites, like the coronavirus website, you would not have to pay that in order to access that. It was a measure to try and facilitate access, to make it cheaper.
So it's free data.
Not quite. Okay. You still need data, but I don't know.
Okay.
Some of the education channels also. So that was a really positive initiative to facilitate access to information. And I must admit, I should have actually found out whether Parliament is zero rated like that or not. I have not, and note to self, we'll find out. Now, one of the things with so there is access. The paper makes a very important point that while journalists and the Parliamentary Press Gallery Association, that core of senior journalists who are based at Parliament and who report as their job on Parliament, have gained access through various WhatsApp groups where documents are shared. It's a little bit more difficult if you are from outside. So you do rely on YouTube channels, and yes, there are problems with the sound at times. And when there are 51 committee meetings in a week, it can be that, some of the committee meetings don't get covered.
But how did you do that before when they were physical?
We ran around like crazy, literally.
Right, so you were running the corridors.
Absolutely, yes. Obviously, one prioritizes. But yes, it was access. So if you are from outside, if you're a member of the public, you do rely on Parliament informing, or Parliament putting out statements on its website saying, here is the Facebook links, or tweeting those links. It can be difficult, but it is happening, and I think in that way, certainly access has been facilitated.
So maybe just to take a step
Yes.
back before we get into the open discussion, what do you think is the value of the paper in terms of the review that Rebecca has done?
I think it's very important. I think, as I said, the paper starts off at a very important point. The point that Parliament suspended itself, then realized it could not do so, and then resumed business. It traces the efforts and attempts and successes and achievements in terms of establishing remote and Zoom, whatever online platform, yes, that they have done. I think the paper raises some of the difficulties that I've also mentioned in terms of data, and Rebecca also spoke to it in terms of data access. I think it is very interesting in the sense that it raises, Rebecca did not talk about this, but it raises the point about constituency work. Personally, I think the point that the paper makes, and I'd like to take it to a further conclusion, that now that we have all this remote logging on and remote committee meetings and also hybrid Parliament sessions, certainly government officials are saving a lot of money. Where is that money going?
How much money do you think it is? Are we talking tens of millions?
Millions, tens of millions, possibly. It depends on departments. For example, if you are the SAPS, whenever there is a meeting, I know that basically half the big committee rooms are taken up by the police delegation. Other departments travel a lot more tight. So it's very difficult. I would, back of the napkin calculation, I would say easily tens of millions of rands on travel, because it's travel, it's subsistence, it's possibly a hotel night stay, yes. And but that's something possibly subject for future research. Yeah. The point is, it could not have come at a better time, because we are in a financial crisis. We are having an incredibly difficult situation. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni is stepping down and saying public servants will get effectively a 0% increase. The negotiations will test that, but we are in that stage. So it would be interesting to see whether departments have calculate that into their savings, or whether they've slightly shifted it somewhere else. The other question is, and here I slightly disagree with Rebecca, is that MPs and NCOP delegates do get plane tickets to travel from their constituencies to Parliament and elsewhere. It would be interesting to see how much of that is saved. Not every MP lives in his or her constituency. That's the one proviso I would like to make. So it could very well be that an MP lives in Johannesburg but has a Northwest constituency that would require travel, or maybe even a Northern Cape constituency. Those decisions are made by political parties. Okay. So that's the one proviso. But I think certainly that is something I think that could be where this paper from Rebecca is a jumping point, jump off point.
So if we come back to the holding executive to account, Rebecca, maybe you can just speak about what quantity has the Parliament produced in terms of its oversight and its work. And then we can cut back to you, Marianne, and maybe you can give an insight of what you think the quality of that oversight has been like. So Rebecca, quantity, what's your sense?
Thank you, Chris. I think in terms of quantity, I think over 600 meetings have been held. I don't want to ballpark it, but in terms of oversight, especially after Parliament got back into its rhythm, I think one would expect that because of the interruption of the pandemic that, you'd see a very large decline in numbers of meetings held, in number of question times held, number of questions asked. But it seems like the trend has been kept that we have seen over the years, that Parliament has asked, members of Parliament have been asking the same number of questions to government representatives, to ministers. They've been holding the same number of meetings, sometimes even more. Even now during the recess period, you've seen some committee meetings consistently active. I think COGTA, particularly because of its role during the pandemic, but also for other issues. So in terms of quantity, I don't think we can fault Parliament when it comes to oversight.
Okay. And quality, Marianne?
Spotty. I'm sure many people will agree. Whether they do so publicly or privately is, of course, up to them. Look, I think much of what Parliament does, and Rebecca, you made that point earlier quite correctly, is that there's a whole lot of issues and workload that has nothing to do with the pandemic that still must happen. So, for example, we are in the middle of checking up and having hearings on the annual performance plan and the strategic plans, which is part and parcel of the whole budget approval process. And the budget votes are kicking off, scheduled the 13th in a week or so. There's legislation to be done. There's a constitutional amendment on expropriation without compensation to be done. But, and this is where I like to backtrack. There was an attempt to try and establish a state of disaster overarching committee where everything could be checked and overseen, held to account, for want of a better word. Parliament has decided against that. The presiding officer said that every single committee of Parliament has a job to do, which is perfectly understandable and perfectly legitimate. But what has happened now is the level of oversight on what is essentially stepped up executive governance.
That's the state of disaster.
In the state of disaster, yes. So as Rebecca outlined earlier, it is the cooperative governance minister who does the overarching regulations. Different individual ministers may do their own directions. There's no public comment needed, there's nothing. So given this emphasis on executive governance, Parliament as the legislative sphere and as the sphere that is constitutionally mandated, it must hold the executive and all other organs of state to account, would have had to step up its oversight. Particularly, I think it was perhaps more intense and close at the start of the lockdown, given the restrictions, given some of the police brutality that we've witnessed, Colin Khoza and the successful court case by his family, and the judgment that came out against the SANDF and the police as a case in point, but also, for example, some of the regulations. No chickens, the jokes about the no chickens to be sold.
So maybe that's the question to come in, which is how much was COGTA actually supervised? Because I think they're the crucial piece here. Yeah. They're the keystone of the disaster.
Yeah. And I did a bit of research. As far as I know, there were a couple of meetings that COGTA Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma came to Parliament. remotely connected to be held to account. One of those meetings was in April. A meeting in July was more about ESCOM and the defaulting municipalities, which the minister then says to speak to National Treasury about it. And to the best of my recollection, and anyone wants to correct me, absolutely, that was it. Which I'm not quite sure. I think Cooperative Governance Committee did what it could have done. I do know that much of the hearings that Cooperative Governance held, often late at night, once or twice a week, were engagements with municipalities. Some of that engagement, yes, was about COVID-19 measures, was about COVID-19 PPE measures. So it does relate back. But in terms of holding to account the minister who the state of disaster effectively allows to make all sorts of regulations for, yes. Okay. The NCOP has had Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma appear before it. There was a special briefing together with the health ministers within Pisa in May 2020, and obviously the minister, Cooperative Minister, is in the House to answer ministerial questions. So that level has happened, but at a committee level, health has a regular engagement with the health minister every other week or so, more or less. Plans of, for example, the last couple of meetings, we've had updates on the vaccine rollout plans, the shifting of, as one discusses these things, gaps are found and things are changed. These were all presented to the committee. So there's a fairly good interaction happening. Whether the questions and whether the engagement is at a level which would satisfy people is another question. So, for example, the last session that we had, 2 weeks ahead of the May 17 official formal phase 2 rollout for vaccines for everyone over 60, we still haven't got a settled list of where one goes for vaccines. Big MPs ask, not so much.
Okay. But of course, then it's also a question of how effective Parliament is in the usual course of business, so maybe expecting more is unrealistic. Yeah. Rebecca, if we go back to you, a section of your report spoke about voting. It also looked at the international context. And voting is one of these key parts of what parliaments do. Maybe can you speak a little bit about voting in Parliament, in the digital setting, in the hybrid setting, and how we're doing internationally?
I think that it's important to note that as much as the technological interruption changed a lot of things, it didn't change some. So in terms of voting, a member of Parliament will still likely vote with their party. So just because you aren't physically in the House, it doesn't mean that part will change much. So obviously the rules had to change to accommodate virtual voting, and members more often than not used to vote by proxy. So chief whips would be the ones casting the votes on behalf of their members, or members would be in the House and verbally vote. So I think that's the one thing that we saw. In other jurisdictions, for example, I think the UK is one where they put up voting booths kind of in the House, and members on voting days would physically come in. Whereas they'd been working remotely for most of the week, on voting days they physically come in, join a socially distanced queue and cast their vote. It was very time heavy, but it happened. And obviously people don't really social distance and all of that happens. And then you have other jurisdictions like I think Spain, which already had the technology in place to allow MPs to vote remotely and individually in secret. So you as an MP log into whatever the technology is and you cast your vote independently, individually in secret from wherever you are. And I think that is a beautiful example of what can be done when technology is applied properly, especially when you take into account what the meaning of voting is. And that, we have had many instances in our own parliament where the idea of voting with your conscience has been raised, it's been challenged toward the party line, etc. So here in South Africa, during the period that that the paper evaluates, voting took place. But the nature of voting, the context of voting, I don't think that changed much at all.
That's really helpful. Marianne, do you have any views on the voting situation in digital?
Yes, I would like to slightly disagree on that. I'm taking it back to oversight again. One of the things that has been lost is what used to happen on a vote, whether that's a piece of legislation or a controversial issue or an appointment to one of the statutory and constitutional bodies, is that because members were in the House, they would press the button on their benches and they would be recorded, and the next day the individual votes would be published as part of the minutes of proceedings. So you could literally track who voted how, where. We have an open voting system. We don't do secret ballot unless it's by prior application.
Special decree.
Yes, yeah. And then it's up to the speaker to decide. So one of the things that has happened now is as Rebecca mentioned, we do the vote by proxy, which is interesting. So you would see the chief whips of the different parties standing up and saying, I have so-and-so many members in the House, so-and-so many members on the virtual platform, these are the numbers, and this is how we vote. And then the votes would be tallied, and all that would then happen is that the presiding officer would ask, is there any member who wishes to vote other than the party line? Nobody as yet has taken up that option, but it is there. And then the next day, the results would be published. Now, as per party, so the ANC, so many votes, DA, so many votes, and 4 against. So it looks fine. What we haven't got is the individual track record that hasn't been published. And one of the incidents, which is for me quite telling, is on the 17th of March when the House voted in favor to support the inquiry to set up a Section 194 committee to inquire into the public protector's fitness for office, is that the vote outcome at the end of the session was 275 for this inquiry, 40 against, which was largely the BFF, and then 1 abstention, which was COPE. As it turns out, 3 more votes were found. So exactly, yes. So the actual count is 278 votes in favor of setting up the inquiry, 40, possibly 41 against, and 1 abstention. Now, fundamentally, the vote outcome, hasn't changed. Fundamentally, that 4 more votes were found is actually a tribute and a credit to the systems behind and the accountability mechanisms behind the scenes, because a track is kept on an individual level. So we do know how MPX voted and whether MPX voted in the House or on the virtual platform. That these individualized results are still not being published in the minutes of proceedings, if not the next day, because it does require a little bit of cleaning up, and it's complex to merge physical and virtual records. But then maybe 2-3 days afterwards, the fact that these records are not yet published, I think is something that really does need to be improved. And I think it's important that we come back to having these records available, because whereas you and I and Rebecca and anyone who is here today can do Google searches and library searches and get an understanding of the time. If, however, in about 10 years' time or so, some researcher or academic or student or other journalist would like to go back and have a look at today's context in the absence of these records, it may be difficult. And I think it's absolutely crucial for Parliament as the legislative sphere that has oversight of the executive to be keeping an accurate and comprehensive record of its work.
And that sort of ties into what we were talking about of if it is the oversight or of the oversight, which is public participation and media participation in Parliament. Rebecca, in your report, what was your perspective on whether public access to Parliament has been improved? You spoke a little bit about this earlier, but quality-wise, were there any troubles with people accessing portfolio committee meetings? In recent cases, I don't know if you know specifically about the PPE corruption scandal. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit. So maybe speak a little bit about public participation through the digital and the hybrid mechanism. How did that go?
I think in terms of public participation, we did see a significant decline. And I think you pointed out earlier, Chris, that even before the pandemic, it's not as if every single person was aware that you can walk into Parliament. Also, Parliament is in Cape Town, so not anybody can just walk into Parliament and attend a committee meeting. Now, specifically, well, one of the interviewees when I was doing the research told me that the reason why committee meetings are no longer including members of the public as the way they did prior to the pandemic is because of the hiccups or the incidents that we saw at the very beginning, you know, the hacking and the more unscrupulous stuff that Marianne alluded to earlier. So now it's more difficult than it was before for a member of the public to just access a committee meeting. Over and above that, because Parliament is not uploading committee meetings effectively or all committee meetings, then that's even worse because you can't go after the fact and watch the recording. It's also interesting to note that Parliament has a very limited number of YouTube pages, I think 10 or something. So not all committee meetings are going to be uploaded anyway. So if you go back over the past year that we've been in this kind of hybrid virtual setting, you're not going to find all the committee meetings. And I'm not talking about just the state security ones that are closed to the public anyway. I mean, generally, you know? So you're not going to see all the committee meetings that, you know, you would generally should have had access to. So I definitely think there has been a marked decline in public access to committee meetings, be it NCOP or NA. That, I think, is a shame. And that must be addressed.
Can I maybe jump in here? The question by Penny Herbst around, which, if I understand correctly, about the public being able to prioritize certain matters, for example, transparency in vaccine delivery. Would previously the public have been able to affect the conversation in portfolio committees better than they can now? So that hasn't really changed.
I don't think so. I think it's very important to remember as well that even during public participation hearings in the House, in Parliament, it was members of civil society who have made submissions, written submissions before that get invited specifically to come and speak. So even then, the public participation was very limited. So it's not just you and I who can walk off the street into Parliament. It's people who have made written submissions, whose job it is to keep abreast with matters of Parliament, whose job it is to keep abreast with a certain committee's progress. So I don't think that part has changed much.
Okay, and for vaccines, it's really then up to civil society to push harder to get transparency. Marianne, would you agree with Rebecca?
I think the point is very important, and it is something that certainly Parliament has battled with. Access to Parliament, to public hearings, to make representations is a given to the usual culprits, for want of a better word. So you will have SATU, you will have Business South Africa, you will have Banking Association, etc., 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 etc. I do know that many committees have tried to try and open up access. I know that there are a number of civil society organizations that have tried to do their bit to facilitate that. It's not always been a happy meeting point. But that was a situation that also existed before. I think one reason why, for example, the 2018 public hearings across South Africa on whether there should be a constitutional amendment for expropriation without compensation was, for me certainly, standing heads and shoulders above many other public participation processes is, one, the MPs actually went out and about, two, the venues were accessible and people came, and often people were assisted to come by local organizations or local politicians, be that as it may. It is something that Parliament, I think, largely is aware of. I think there are some committees, for example, I remember Yunus Karim when he was still in charge of the Standing Committee on Finances, certainly that was before 2019 May, certainly has expressed frustration that every time the Standing Committee on Finance had public hearings, it was the same people that usually came. Parliament would say it doesn't have resources. I'm thinking, and maybe Rebecca would jump in here, I'm thinking that maybe a little bit more creative, sort of lateral, out-of-the-box thinking needs to be applied.
Yeah.
I do agree, absolutely.
You know, it's funny, I just smile as you were saying that, because I try to project forward to what this means if we actually no longer have a geographical center that Parliament always has to return to. Earlier on in the Q&A, somebody mentioned the purported move of Parliament away from Cape Town. So in what is now Germany, in the medieval period, Parliament moved around from town to town, village to village. And that way people could participate, or at least they could benefit as well from that economic activity that is Parliament. So in theory, Rebecca, could you imagine that in the future that technology would allow Scopa, for example, to do its hearings in
Anyway.
Middelburg? In Potchefstroom?
I do imagine that a hybrid parliament is where we're going to find ourselves in the future. But my concerns about South Africans having access to this hybrid parliament remain.
Yeah.
Particularly because we are 20 odd years into democracy and the divide has not been closed, significantly. So it's great for you and I to sit here whilst we're holding this virtual webinar, because we are able to participate. We can tap into these resources. But until a concerted effort is made to bring those South Africans who do not have access, to the table, then there's no point. We will remain an exclusionary parliament, and it won't be a parliament for the people. And things like zero rating will take us that much closer to a place where everyone is at the table. And I'm talking about zero rating radio stations. I'm talking about zero rating, channels online. It's zero rating content, zero rating Parliament's website. Why do I have to pay to visit Parliament's website? Things like that. Once you open up access, then it makes it feasible for a hybrid parliament that actually works, that is inclusive, that is effective, that won't be challenged.
I'd like to take a different tack. Monique, I see you jumped in as well. But Monique makes a really interesting point about body language, and something that we're all trying to learn is what body language means in this hybrid world. Marianne, what's been your experience about body language and the effect it has that we're trying to connect through?
I'm absolutely delighted somebody actually took that up, because that is exactly one of the things where in all the Zoom and online and virtual meetings, all of that has gone away. And I do believe that that has an impact on oversight, because one of the committees that did sit in person during this time was the Powers and Privileges Committee, having a look at the EFF-MP's disruption of Public Enterprises Minister's budget vote speech in 2019. And the quality and the texture of that interaction in that committee was significantly different to, the common sort of online committee meeting. We've got a 2-hour slot. Can you make the presentation? Questions asked, done. And it does take me back to the kind of collegiality that physical presence and interaction in person brings is a very important ingredient in greasing the wheels of parliamentary business, for want of a way of saying it, because it's absolutely important and it's crucial that different political parties work together in committees, in the House, behind the scenes, to try and facilitate oversight, accountability, legislation making, because that's what Parliament needs to do.
So maybe on that point, when somebody asks me a difficult question over a screen, then I tend to be looking away, or I find it hard to pay attention. How did officials, state officials, generally appear over the screen? Were parliamentarians able to interact with them and put them in their place?
No, I don't think so. And this is, look, I have no scientific basis, and if you were to ask me, where's the science, I can't. But as somebody who watches Parliament and who engages and works in Parliament, certainly I think that officials really have taken advantage of the virtual platforms by, even more so than usual, picking and choosing what they're answering and how they're answering. And on a virtual platform, some of the protocols that committees have kind of translated from the physical realm online don't work. So in a physical committee meeting, the chairperson, someone would give the official a funny look, because we all know that the official is fudging it, to be polite. And that may then lead to an MP picking up and rolling with further questions. None of those physical cues happen online. And so, for example, the officials know that, and of course they're going to take advantage of it. And it's part of the difficulties and the challenges. And it's one of the reasons why I wish Parliament would actually resume its physical meetings.
But that would mean the state of disaster stopping, which I don't think you believe in.
No, I don't. Not at the moment. I think it's working. People like it too much in many ways, those with power. But no, it actually doesn't. You see, this is, and maybe this is one of the important things. Parliament is a workplace. Parliament could be operating at 100%. And even if the limitations of no meetings over 250 people, that would affect sittings in the House, yes, but certainly not committee meetings. So there's nothing stopping Parliament from resuming committee meetings, from resuming, for example, reopening the Parliamentary Library, which is closed. Yes, the argument would be that there may be physical, logistical limitations. Some of the committee rooms are small, but by reopening physical committee meetings, it would go precisely to what we talked about. It would allow, again, people, members of the public, journalists, from entering that space and being part and parcel of deliberations, if not actually talking back to MPs, but being there and being a reminder to our parliamentarians that they do their job because they were elected by us to do their job.
I'm just getting forward. We are a little bit out of time, but Peter, I see Peter Montalto in the Q&A referring to the fact that simply ignoring questions is becoming more common in committee meetings. and really is a question of how to address this topic.
Yeah.
Peter, I suggest that you actually reach out to Marianne directly because we are out of time.
Yeah.
So I only just sort of.
I think in some ways we've talked about it precisely when I said officials are simply picking and choosing what to.
And that's the answer. So maybe as a concluding point, going forward, hybrid parliament or normal parliament?
I think certainly a hybrid.
In a word.
Hybrid parliament, but more physical sittings. It cannot just be unfolding on an online
As it
platform
is.
anymore.
And Rebecca, your view?
Hybrid parliament, but I think that everybody should reserve the right to choose whether to be physically present.
Right, that makes sense because for some people it might not work as well. Well, great. Thank you very much to both of you, Marianne and to Rebecca. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Again, I'd like to ask everybody in the audience to please visit www.themidpoint.org.za to download the paper, have a look. And of course, reach out to us if you have any questions, want to take up any issues. And we're always inviting people to propose new subjects as well for future midpoint discussions. So thank you very much, and I hope that you have a lovely rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.